Hey, PLO 5 Card Mastermind, how is it going? My name is Ryan, aka Fitz, and today we're going to be looking at 3-bet pots out of position, talking about our c-betting range on mid to low boards. There's often a lot of scenarios where we 3-bet preflop and sort of a board that doesn't interact very well with our range comes, and that can be a lot of difficult turn and river transitions, a lot of spots where we become sort of unsure of what to do with our hands. And that's sort of what we're going to aim to tackle today in this particular video. So for the sake of this video, any kind of mid to low board is just going to be a board that has one or less Broadway cards on it and is unpaired and also does not contain a straight. The examples I'm going to use are going to be from small blind versus button 3-bet pot scenarios where we are obviously the small blind player, but a lot of these concepts can be applied to other spots of the game tree where we are the 3-better out of position. So the first key thing to think about when we are in this kind of position is how our ranges affect our strategy. Understanding from a macro perspective, the spot as a whole is going to sort of give us some key insights on how to play our particular hand, how to play our range as a whole. One of the things that is going to enable us to understand the ranges at play and how our strategy should be implemented is thinking about how much aces impacts our frequency. And we obviously know that in 5-card aces make a big part of our 3-bet range preflop. So therefore, when a board interacts very well with an ace, obviously mid to low boards don't have an ace on them, but more so boards where we have more equity against our opponent's range, they're going to be boards where we can be a little bit more aggressive. We have better runouts, more equity. And this is going to change from a board texture where our aces don't have a lot of equity, or our aces are going to sort of lack in runouts. So if we think about a board like 9, 3 deuce, 2 tones, aces make up almost 40% of our range on this board. And what you can see here is our frequency is going to be only 30% checking, so betting 60% for either half pot or full pot. And again, that is because on a board like 3 deuce, 9 3 deuce, our aces are going to have a lot of equity against our opponent's calling range. He shouldn't be having too many hands that interact with the wheel cards, whereas obviously our aces in particular are going to do quite well because it's very easy to have a hand like aces in a gut shot, and they have a lot of equity on this particular board. Whereas if you look at another texture like Queen 8 4, we are checking half of our range, betting half of our range. Again, aces don't really interact too well with this board texture, or at least the equity we have with them is going to be significantly less. And that is one of the things we should be keeping in mind when we do see a particular flop after 3-betting. If you have a look at the equity graphs in front of you, you can kind of see an illustration of that. On the left-hand side, there is a little bit of a difference. You can see that they look somewhat similar, but the gap between the blue line, which is our equity, and the red line, which is the imposition, the button player's equity, is going to be a little bit wider. And that is basically entailing that our aces, or our range in general, is going to be a little bit more favorable on this particular board texture. So how our aces interact with the board is a very important thing to think about. And that sort of ties into the next point, which is that equity is one of the main things to think about when we determine our strategy as a whole. And at a low SPR scenario is going to play slightly differently, or quite differently, to a high SPR scenario when we are out of position, because at a high SPR scenario, polarity matters a lot more, whereas at a lower SPR, the polarity doesn't affect our range as much, because we can stack off much easier. We have to worry less about runouts and our opponent leveraging his imposition polarity advantage on particular boards. We care a lot more about our equity, and that sort of, again, ties into the previous point about aces, but our equity also has a lot to do with our runouts as well, and this is one of the things that also plays a key role in thinking about our range. So if we have a look at two different boards here, we have Queen 7-6 and Jack 5-3, both rainbow. You can see that there's a big disparity in the c-bet frequencies on these board textures. The right-hand side, we are c-betting a lot more. Left-hand side, we are checking a lot more. And if you have a look at the equity graphs, again, they do look quite similar. We are both lacking in polarity a lot of the time, As you can see that the red line up the top of each equity graph, if I just quickly highlight that for you guys, you can see that the in-position play is going to have more hands like sets, more hands like two pairs with strong backup. And the equity, by the way, is quite similar. Yes, there is a bit of a larger gap down here. And that is sort of basically coming from our runouts. And on a board like Jack 5-3, if you think about the board changing turns and rivers, hands when the board texture brings in, say, a straight, for example, our opponent is going to have less straights, and there is just in general less straightening cards that are bad for us on a board like Jack 5-3, whereas on Queen 7-6 there are more straightening cards that can come in, and we will have to be very wary of that because our aces, like we said before, aren't going to do too well on these cards, whereas on Jack 5-3 we don't perform as poorly on these straightening cards, and that is sort of enabling us to bet more frequently because our runouts are, generally speaking, better on these sort of more disconnected lower wheel card textures. And this is sort of going to play into the next factor that is going to determine our strategy as a whole, is equity denial. And on these very dry textures, we are sort of allowed to pot a lot of our hands to deny our opponent equity with our aces, because those hands can actually stack off against a raise a lot of the time. So let's talk about this a little bit. If you have a look at these two charts in front of you, I have on the left-hand side two-toned board textures, on the right-hand side rainbow textures. What you will notice, particularly as the board textures get lower on the right-hand side, you can see that our betting range skews a lot more to potting our hands on boards like Jack 5-3, which we already saw, 10-7-5, and then in particular 7-4 deuce. Whereas on the left-hand side, that's not so much the case on these boards. We tend to lean towards using our half-pot c-bet frequency more so than being like purely pot. And that has to do with basically our runouts, but also the fact that on these very dry rainbow textures, because aces make up a big part of our range, and they are allowed to stack off on boards like 7-4 deuce very frequently because they have more equity, this basically enables our c-bet frequency to go through the roof and our potting frequency to be very high as well. And the other thing, again, to sort of tie into this whole thing, is equity denial with our aces is very important on a board like 7-4 deuce, because we can get a lot of folds from hands. If we have a hand like aces with a gut shot, for example, getting a hand like a bear 7 to fold is going to be very beneficial for us because we can push out, as that hand will have a substantial amount of equity against aces, but our aces on these boards are able to stack off. It's also worth considering, again, that on these very dry rainbow textures, they have less board-changing rivers, turns and rivers that interact well with our opponent, and that is going to obviously benefit us as the out-of-position player. So now we sort of understand a little bit more about how these board textures should be played from a macro perspective, but now let's think a little bit about how we should play each hand and how we sort of come to the decision of what we should do. So the first question we want to ask ourselves, or what we should consider, is what we sort of already talked about, the macro portion. What is the board texture? How does that interact with our range or our opponent's range? And also considering what the stack to pot ratio is, because obviously in these examples, we are assuming that everyone is 100 big blinds deep. But if your opponent's, you are maybe deeper with your opponent or shallower, that is going to affect the stack off thresholds. That's going to affect how important equity is. At a lower SPR, equity will be more important. And if the SPR is higher, polarity and runouts will become much more important. So once we've sort of established these key factors, the next thing to think about, and the sole, I guess, question to ask ourselves is, how do we generate the most EV from our hand, or what line makes the most sense in order to get the most efficient EV, I would say. So there's a few questions we need to ask ourselves with each particular hand, and I sort of want to basically give you guys a formula, or at least mention to you what things you should be thinking about with a particular hand, rather than saying things like sets should be doing this, two pairs should be doing that, because I think by establishing a very educated thought process, it's going to be much more beneficial for you overall, because there are so many variable factors when it comes to each board texture, but also different hands in general. Contextually, they're going to matter a lot more, and it's very difficult to start simplifying strength buckets, and also very difficult to implement this strategy. So the things that we want to be thinking about here, first of all, I think a good thing to think about is if our hand is strong enough to stack off, that is often going to be an interesting thing to think about, because on a rainbow texture, for example, this is very important. If we have a big potting range, we want to think about, okay, yes, we have a big potting range, we understand why. Then is my hand good enough to stack off? Then maybe we should think about potting our particular hand, for example. There are other scenarios where this will come into play as well. The other thing to think about if we maybe want to consider betting our hand is whether or not we push out hands we dominate. This is very important at a low SPR, because we often find ourselves slow playing hands like sets because they push out hands like bad 2-pair, and that is obviously not going to be very beneficial for us as the out of position player. This can also be the case with hands like nut flush draws, where if we have a nut flush draw that has significant backup, we probably don't want to bet large with that hand, because we might push out a hand that we do very well against, like a weaker flush draw. Another thing to think about is if we do bet, what do we do versus a raise? And then also the same goes for if we check our hand, what do we do versus a bet? These are important things to consider, because this can skew our decision to either betting if we don't mind, for example, folding against a raise, or maybe if we maybe would prefer to play our hand as a check because we can check call, but we don't want to bet fold our hand, for instance. So let's sort of try and take these concepts and apply them now in some more practical examples. So let's start off with a board of Jack 5-3. We have the frequencies in front of us. You can see that we're primarily potting a lot of our range. As we mentioned before, our aces can often stack off, and a big portion of these hands benefit a lot from equity denial from our opponent's 1-pair hands. So if we have a look at a example of ace, jack 7-6. So here we have the overpair, top pair blocker, and the nut gut shot with also a nut backdoor flush draw. This is a good example of a hand that is going to elect to pot a lot of the time. And the reason for this is, we've talked about equity denial. So this hand benefits a lot from that. It benefits from getting folds from a lot of different hands, like 1-pair hands, for example. The other thing is that we have strong blockers, which is obviously going to be increase the EV of our bet. We block hands like Jack 5 and Jack 3 that are going to do very well against us. Also top set. And we have very good runouts with this particular hand on this board with a lot of our range. And so when we pot, we obviously can stack off versus a raise, but also on the turn, there's a lot of turn cards where we can also continue to just commit on basically any card, really. There's not too many cards where we're worried about with this particular hand. And we're not really worried about folding off like hands that we dominate. We're mainly, with this hand, looking to get folds from a lot of equity. But if we have a look at a hand like ace, king, queen, jack, jack, this is an example of a hand that is actually going to look to check, and top set is basically always going to check on this particular board texture. It is going to be a little bit different on other boards, which is kind of, again, tying into the fact that there's a lot of dynamic situations, and on a board like Jack 5-3, because it is so disconnected, the jack is going to be a significant blocker in terms of our opponent's continuing range. And one of the reasons why we don't choose to bet jacks on this board texture is because we are blocking a significant amount of our opponent's continuing range, especially hands that we do extremely well against, like 1-pair hands, like 2-pair hands. It makes it extremely likely our opponent is either going to fold, or if he continues, has a hand like a straight draw. Whereas if we check this hand, we give him the opportunity to start putting in bets with very weak holdings that we do extremely well against. If he maybe chooses to bet a hand like a 5, like a 3, that wouldn't call a bet, but would now choose to bet, that is going to increase the EV of a hand. And that is kind of why thinking about how we can get the most or generate the most EV is going to be the most important thing. Also, at a low SPR, you will find a lot of these hands look to check more often, or check call in particular more often, because we are less worried about getting all the money in on the turn and the river, given that the stack to pot to ratio is a lot smaller, and our opponent can commit a lot lighter on the turn and the river, given the stack to pot ratio is lower. So again, we don't really need to worry so much about check raising and what if we lose value against a hand like 5s or 3s or 2 pairs when the board texture changes, for example. We just elect check call a lot of our sets in 3-bet pots, especially on board textures like this, and especially with top set in general. Let's have a look now. Want to go into some more practical hand examples. So let's go into the trainer. And we'll do this board here, first of all, as we are using Jack 5-3. And we'll start off by talking again about how we should think about playing this particular hand. So here we have ace, ace, 7, 6, deuce. We have the overpair. We have the nut gut shot. We also have the deuce, the ace deuce, which is going to be a significant blocker to our opponent's continuing range. We know on this board texture, which we have already established, we are very incentivized to pot hands like this and get equity denial. We can stack off on the turn a lot of the time. And whilst this hand doesn't have a pair blocker, we do have that additional equity with the gut shot, and is likely this hand class is a very, very frequent pot. So I am going to elect to pot this particular hand. And often aces that have sort of like a little bit of backup, like a pair blocker, like a gut shot on these very dry board textures, are going to look to pot. Whereas maybe if we had a hand like aces with an open-ended straight draw, maybe if we had a hand like ace, ace, 6-4 with a backdoor, not backdoor flush draw, 2 backdoor flush draws, they're going to be hands that we would maybe elect to bet small with. Here, ace, ace, queen, 10, 5 with one backdoor nut flush draw, again, probably falls into the category of wanting to pot, deny a lot of equity. Whilst we don't have that straight draw, we do have a 5, which is going to play some impact on our opponent's continuing range. If we had a pair blocker, we would obviously prefer it to be a jack, but I think here we probably have enough equity to stack off, and the problem becomes if we do check this hand, there are a lot of difficult scenarios where, for example, if our opponent decides to check back and then we have to play out of position on a turn and river, that could potentially be very problematic. And the SPR won't be too low because it has gone check, check. So again, I think this hand has enough to justify potting. In fact, it is going to be a half pot. Let's just take a look at similar hands. So if we have a look at any overpair, that includes aces, that includes a board pair that isn't a jack, and includes a backdoor nut flush draw and no straight draw. Can see that these hands in general, which is the hand we had before, they very often look to pot. There are some scenarios where we do sometimes half pot, and then the ones that elect to check are very few and far between. Hands like ace, ace, 8, 8, 3, they don't really have much board interaction, and also the 3 isn't going to play a big of a, as much of a role as, say, the 5 or the jack. So when I look at hands like this, and I can see that thematically a lot of these hands are going to stack off or pot and stack off, I don't really mind too much getting a hand like this wrong. We are mainly looking to think about our thought process and use that to establish the right decision. There is going to be a lot of hands like this where sometimes there are small deviations in the solver, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. We are much more concerned about our thought process here. Ace, ace, king, 10, 6 is kind of a close decision. We have a hand that has 2 backdoor flush draws, and we have 6, which is going to certainly give us a little bit more fold equity here. I'm just not sure if this hand is quite strong enough to stack off, like pot and stack off, or if the solver is going to do that without some kind of pair blocker. The 6 is going to be fairly beneficial because it makes it more likely we can basically pot the flop, and then if our opponent calls, there are more turns where we are willing to stack off on. Whereas that wouldn't be the case if our 6 was, say, like a 9, for example. So And the EV of checking this hand similarly to the ace, queen, 10, 5 hand is kind of a spot where if we check, we do sometimes run into a few problems on turns and rivers when the nut changes. So this hand could maybe be a check, but I think potting is also reasonable. It could be close either way. I'm going to go ahead and pot this hand. You can see, in fact, it's not going to be strong enough to pot. We have a look at the same hands. We don't have a backdoor flush draw, but we have backdoor flush draw 2, and we don't have a straight draw. What you can see here is there's a lot of mixing with this particular hand class, and we tend to pot more hands that have a little bit more interaction with the board texture. You can see hands like ace, 8, 7, 7. So the 2 7s blocking more of the straight draws, meaning we can stack off more on the turn. Hands like ace, queen, 8, 6, for example, we have a few more like backdoor equity hands. And a lot of these hands also have 2 backdoor nut flush draws as well, which is going to have a bit of a higher EV in terms of potting. So this hand may be a little bit of a mistake from myself. But for the most part, these hands are going to be potting. And this is kind of the thing where you guys should be doing your own study, your own training in these spots, because it does take a little bit of practice, as you can see, in terms of which hands we maybe want to, or what sort of the thresholds are on different board textures, and that kind of thing. So we'll go back now into another board texture example. If we go back to our slides and move on to a board texture of queen 4-3, where we're going to look to apply some of the same concepts. So if we have a look at this board here, the first thing again we should be thinking about is the macro decision, or the macro perspective. On this board, we are going to check half of our range. We don't interact insanely well with our aces. Yes, the 4-3 is going to be interact sometimes with our aces, but our opponent is still going to have a lot of hands like 6-5 and straight draws that can do very well on this texture. It's also two-tone, so our runouts, the board texture is going to change quite frequently. So we have to be considerate of that as the out-of-position player. And if we look at a hand like King, Queen, Jack, 10, 8, here, this is a good example of a hand that we are going to elect to bet half pot with. So we have a hand that has very decent blockers. We have top pair, we have the King of Hearts. And these are both going to increase our fold equity, which is obviously what we want with a hand like this once we do decide to bet it. It's also not really a hand that can check call. Once we face a bet, it's going to be very difficult to have enough. We don't really have enough components to make our hand to continue, but we do have that backdoor flush draw. We also have some backdoor straight draws, and we kind of want to get to the turn as efficiently as possible so that we can sort of realize that equity. And because we have those components with decent blockers, that kind of enables us to bet with this hand. We choose not to bet pot because once we bet pot, we don't really want to stack off with this hand. We also don't have enough blockers to justify a pot, really. And the other thing to think about with this hand is we don't really mind bet folding for half pot. Where if we think about our opponent's raising range here, is going to do extremely well against this particular hand. Let's have a look at 2 hands on the right-hand side here. Ace, Ace, King, Queen, 7, where we have top pair, nut, flush draw, and 3 hearts, and the overpair. And a very similar hand where we have also an overpair and the nut flush draw, but this time we have the nut gut shot. And ask yourselves what you would sort of do with both of these hands very quickly. And basically the hand on the top is going to be a pot, and the hand on the bottom is going to be a half pot c-bet. And what you will see very frequently is a hand like this at the top with 3 hearts, so 3 flush draw blockers, is going to be frequently a hand that we want to pot. It can often stack off on the flop and also on the turn, especially if we have the pair blocker, for example. But because we don't have the greatest runouts with this particular hand, and because we have increased blocker effects, we very much benefit from potting, folding our opponent off a lot of equity. For instance, if he has a hand like a straight draw, if we get the money in, we're not loving it, but we are still doing well enough to go ahead and pot and stack off a hand like this. Whereas down the bottom, we don't actually really want to go ahead and pot this hand, and I think it can be very easy to lean towards potting this this hand on the bottom, mainly because it seems like, you know, we have the nut flush draw, we just want to pot and get it in. But the problem with potting this hand is we push out hands that we do very well against, especially when we have nutted draws. It makes less sense when we have a hand like this to pot, because with the nut gut shot and the nut flush draw, if we pot, we could push out a hand like the king high flush draw, for example, the jack high flush draw, or a hand like a very weak flush draw and a very weak straight draw. All of these components we are doing very, very, very well against, and that's kind of why we would generally elect to bet a hand like this for half pot instead of pot. And generally speaking, both of these hands do in fact want to bet, because they want to get value from hands that would otherwise check back. They have the nut flush draw, and often our opponent is, when he does have a non-nut flush draw, that is an example of a hand that would in fact elect to check back. And we can get value from that by betting, but obviously by checking, if he's going to check back hands like the king high flush draw, then we lose EV with these hands. But it's important not to go overboard with our nut flush draws, especially if we don't have substantial backup, or we don't have like some hand like an overpair or a pair blocker, for instance, because once we get raised, we are not doing too well against our opponent's raising range. So that is something to keep in mind as well. Let's jump back into the trainer and do a little bit of training on this particular texture and talk a little bit more about our decisions. So here, another difficult spot, and I'm sure it's very easy to find ourselves in this scenario. So what should we think about here on this with this particular hand? We have the nut gut shot, or sorry, the non-nut gut shot. We have a non-nut flush draw. So this hand here, without a pair blocker, without an overpair, is in quite an interesting spot. So is our hand okay with bet folding, for instance? If we do decide to bet this hand, we get raised. We're probably very frequently up against a hand like the nut flush draw, or we're up against a hand like two pair with a flush draw, those kinds of things. Both of which we're not doing very well against, and we probably have to bet fold this hand if we do decide to bet it. Then the question, I guess, is, does our hand in fact want to just check call? Is it strong enough to do so? And I think it is somewhat close between check calling and check folding, because our opponent's betting range is going to be heavily weighted towards the nut flush draw. So oftentimes, when we don't have much backup and a weak flush draw, we are going to struggle, especially because our straight draw is non-nutted and because our tens don't really have much showdown value. If our opponent does decide to check back, again, there is it's not like we have a ton of showdown value that can just check it down and win. So given all these factors, I'm going to elect to bet half pot with my hand and go for a half pot fold. I just don't think our hand is quite strong enough to go ahead and check call. And you can see that this particular hand does in fact like to go ahead and bet half pot, and it will without having looked at the hand, it will just fold versus a raise. Here we have a pretty straightforward check with this hand, I would say. No interaction with the board, and remember that we aren't betting a ton in this position, so we are going to go ahead and check. Same can probably be said with a hand like ace, ace, 9, 8, 6. We do have a backdoor nut flush draw, and we do have the 6 of hearts, but it is so likely that we get called or raised, and once that does happen with this particular hand, we are not doing very well. And yes, we do want to realize that equity. We have the backdoor nut flush draw, but again, we're kind of putting money into the pot with a hand that is not going to do very well on turns and rivers, regardless of how the action is. And because we don't have blockers, it's very likely our opponent is going to continue. Same can be said for a hand like King Jack 10 9 6. We will just check this one. And also, I would say the same for this particular hand here. Here, Ace Queen Jack 7 5. So we have top pair, nut flush draw, and the nut gut shot. Probably a good example of a hand that we don't want to pot because we are pushing out a lot of hands we dominate. If we maybe had a slightly different version of this hand where we didn't have the nut gut shot, maybe we had like Ace Queen Jack. I guess maybe Ace Queen Jack 5 deuce, although we don't really have that hand. But basically, if we had a similar hand with a non-nut gut shot, it could make a little bit more sense to pot here. But here, if we pot, we potentially push out a lot of hands that we are doing very well against. Could we potentially check this hand? There is the option to check. It is going to still play fine as a check. But I think with top pair, the nut gut shot and the nut flush draw, we benefit a lot from getting calls from hands that our opponent is just going to check back, and we dominate a lot of those hands. So I'm going to elect to bet half pot here. And here, we'll finish off with this hand. We have King, Queen, 9, 6, 5. So we have top pair, the nut open ender, and the King high flush draw. So here is quite interesting decision to make. So what should we think about again here? Well, is our hand good enough to stack off? Yes, it is good enough to stack off if we do decide to bet. Although, if we get raised a lot of the time, it's not like we're going to have a substantial amount of equity because we're probably going to be up against a hand like the nut flush draw and some kind of backup, or a hand like a set, which is still doing relatively well against us, or a hand like two pair and like very strong backup. So that's something to think about. How do we benefit from betting and like maybe pushing out some hands? I don't really think that is necessarily the case. If we like, I don't think potting makes sense because again, we had that nut straight draw. We do have the top pair as well. So there is a lot of hands that fold once we do pot that we are doing very well against. But if we half pot, we can still get some hands to fold, like kings, for example, that do fairly well against us. Maybe a hand like 4-3. And if we check, a hand has good playability as a check. We would, I'm assuming, just check call our hand. I don't think we would want to check raise it. So I'm kind of in between with this hand. Not entirely sure. We need to make sure that we do protect our checking range here because it's not like we can go overboard on this board texture. We only see bet just over half of our range. So, interesting decision here. I think with this hand, I'm going to play my hand as a check call. Oh, I think it can go either way, really. Maybe I will like to just half pot this one, actually. I'm kind of in between. We do go for the half pot here, and you can see that our hand is going to be a half pot. Probably too good to start like checking and give up a lot of EV from our opponent's check back range. So we'll finish up with that and jump back into our slides where we will just do a quick summary of what we have learned today. So one of the first key concepts when we think about these board textures is that ace-ace makes up a big portion of our range, and how well aces does on a particular board in terms of equity and runouts is going to impact our c-bet frequency. And that is because on these board textures, or because we are at a lower SPR scenario in a 3-bet pot compared to a single race pot, polarity is going to matter less, equity is going to matter a lot more, and these are the kinds of things we should be thinking about. Our overall strategy, especially on disconnected textures, is going to lean more towards potting. But on more connected boards, we tend to check a bit more. We also tend to bet half pot a bit more because we can't really stack off with a lot of our range. After we pot, our aces have less equity on these boards. There's more nut changing runouts on turns and rivers, so that's something to keep in mind as well. The main thing we want to establish once we do 3-bet and get called is sort of the macro elements of the hands, what your opponent's range is, what my range is, and how does it interact with this board. Think about, again, what we talked just recently in terms of how aces interacts. Also consider what the stack to pot to ratio is, how this will sort of adjust our strategy. If it is a high SPR scenario, like if you are deeper, you maybe want to check a bit more. You want to think a bit more about polarity in terms of how that affects our strategy. Whereas at a lower SPR, we can think a bit more about our overall equity and not so much about our polarity or our runouts. Then once we have established these sort of macro ideas, we want to consider with our particular hand, what generates the most EV? And we've sort of discussed some of the things that we want to be thinking about depending on what kind of scenario we're in. One of the things that comes to mind is going to be stuff like, can our hand stack off on the flop or on the turn if we do elect to pot our hand, for instance, or if we elect to bet half pot. And also think about, if after we bet, how does our hand play versus a raise? And also if we maybe think about checking our hand, how does that play versus as a bet? Or how does it play versus a check back? As well, equity denial is something to think about. Does our hand benefit from equity denial? Or maybe we're betting a hand that basically makes it extremely likely our opponent is going to fold off hands that we dominate, for instance, like we saw with top set on Jack 5-5. That is something to consider. Also think about how your blocker effects change from board texture to board texture, because again, on a board like Jack 5-3, the top pair blocker is extremely important and is part of the reason why we always check top set. Whereas if we have middle and bottom set, we tend to bet those more often, just due to our blocker effects. Also remember that our runouts are also going to play a very big impact in our overall strategy. So thank you very much for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.